Welcome to our continued study in Hebrews chapter 11. Today we'll be in Hebrews chapter 11 and we'll be looking at verses 24 to 29 at the faith of Moses. And he becomes a great example of how right faith equals or produces right choices. And so as we read through these 5 verses, we're going to see things that Moses said yes to and things that Moses said no to based on his faith. And so faith, what we learn from his example, is that faith involves choices. And the quality of our lives are determined by the choices we make more than the circumstances. And we'll see that real clear with the life of Moses here. But so your Christian living always involves making right decisions. And you can tell the maturity of a believer or the immaturity of the believer by the choices they make. So, since the beginning of time, it's no big secret, go all the way back to Genesis chapter 3, and we see that God has always given people choices that determine the direction of their life, the quality of their life, in many ways. So we need to make right choices. And sometimes what we see go on around us are simply the consequences of choices, good or bad. And Moses is a perfect example of this. So what we'll do is we'll read through each verse. And the first time we read through these 5 verses, we'll look at all the things Moses said no to. Then we're going to read through them again and we'll look at what Moses said yes to. So that way we'll just see it kind of thematically here. But notice verse 24. So we look at what Moses said no to. It says, by faith Moses, when he became of age, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. So, you remember the story of Moses. He was born during a time when the Jewish babies were being slaughtered by Pharaoh, at least the male babies were, and his parents had hidden him and sent him down the Nile River in a little boat, and Pharaoh's daughter found him and adopted him. And so he came and he lived in the palace for 40 years, right? He became a prince of Egypt. So here he is in this superpower, right? He's in the wealthiest, most advanced society of that day, and he was part of the royal court, and he was highly educated and skilled. But even through all of that culture that he was around, he still got in touch with his Jewish roots and his faith, and he never gave up his faith in God, even in that environment. And so he learned about the hope of Israel and the promise of God. And here what it's telling us in verse 24, that when he became of age, he made a choice. And he said that he said no to the position that he had in Egypt. And he said yes to the hope of Israel. And why did he do that? Because the deciding factor was his faith in God. He said, I'm going to choose God's will over worldly position. And I want to choose God's destiny for my life instead of letting Pharaoh choose the destiny for my life. And so he decided not to partake of that position there in Egypt. From a worldly standpoint, and this is a key, this is what faith does. When we say no to position, when Moses said no to position, it's interesting. Look at it, and you may have felt this in your heart when you hear that. When you hear that, just as it said, Moses refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. Let that sink in for a moment. From a worldly standpoint, you might see that and you say, oh, poor Moses. He gave up everything to follow God. He was sacrificing everything. And what a tremendous sacrifice. And but for Moses, from his viewpoint, his viewpoint was, I'm giving up nothing for everything. From the world standpoint, Moses gave up everything for nothing. You see the difference that faith makes in your perspective? So when he said no to his position in Egypt, by faith, Moses understood that was nothing. Following God is everything. And so he didn't consider it a sacrifice at all. He was sacrificing nothing for everything when he followed God. His conclusion was this: the worst that God has to offer is better than the best the world can give. That's the eternal perspective. The best the world has to offer doesn't hold a candle to what God has to offer. So Moses, he could have cared less about his Egyptian heritage or any advantages he got from his position there in Egypt. The Egyptians were pagan and worldly, and he had given himself to the Lord. He was following God's will for his life, and he realized he had greater things in store for him, and that the world had little to offer compared to the riches and satisfaction of walking with the Lord. So Moses wasn't going to trade a few short years of fame and a fancy tomb. And, we could have been looking at Moses as one of those mummies wrapped in some Egyptian museum nowadays. Instead, he is famous as a man of God, and his life changed the world. So he said no to worldly position. It doesn't interest me. The second thing he saw or said no to was the pleasures of sin. Notice verse 25 of Hebrews 11. Choosing, there's our word, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin. So right now we're still just looking on the things Moses said no to. No to position, now no to the pleasures of sin. And I like the way it words that. It's acknowledging, hey, sin does have its pleasures, but Moses saw the pleasure of sin as passing, that it would be short-lived in terms of pleasure, and it would be long-lived in terms of consequence. That's the one thing, the world is great at pointing out how fun sin is. It can feed our pride. It can satisfy desires. Whatever pleasures you may think it offers, the world promotes it. But what the world hides from you in regards to sin are two things. There's two things the world doesn't want you to notice when it comes to the pleasure of sin. These two characteristics. One, it's always evil, and it's always passing away. So the pleasure of sin is always temporary. It will always fade away. And it will leave you wanting more, so to speak. One great example of this is David. So you remember King David and his adultery with Bathsheba. For that moment of pleasure, for that pleasure of sin that David embraced, he had to watch his infant son die. That was a product of that relationship. And he had to watch another son, Absalom, rebel against him and be hanged. All because of that sin. So we need to understand it's short on pleasure, it can be big on consequence. And that's what the world wants to hide from you. Years ago, when I used to do Bible studies at the juvenile hall, I would ask kids, how on earth did you end up here in jail at such a young age? And they would tell me the stupid things that they did. And they all had a common response after telling you what it is that they did to get there. They always seem to fall back on this. I didn't think I would get caught. I thought I could get away with it. I didn't know there was going to be these consequences, right? And so That's what the world wants to hide from you, is the consequence. And and so they highlight the pleasures, they ignore the consequence, and the how short it all is. So he says no to the pleasures of sin. Notice verse 26. He says no to earthly treasure. It says, esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt, for he looked to the reward, to the eternal reward. So he turned his back on Egypt and everything it represented, and he came to the conclusion that enduring for Christ would be more valuable than the best of the world. That God's reward is greater than the world's reward. And faith enabled him to see that. And so he didn't get caught up in all the earthly treasures that were around him. And then verse 27, he said no to worldly fear. In verse 27, it says, by faith he forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is visible. So he had a little bit of fear about that wrath of the king. You read the story, he hid his wife and kids away from where he was at during that time, just so nothing would happen to him. But also, he questioned God a lot before he went there in front of Pharaoh. And that's what allowed him to overcome that fear. But he did. He put his hand to the plow and he would not look back. And ultimately, he feared God so much, it diminished his fear of Pharaoh. And so, fear is one of the greatest pressures we can face. It's a powerful tool of Satan. You don't have to look any further than this COVID crisis to see what fear does to people. Just like that, everything was shut down over the fear of death. And Satan will use the fear of death to manipulate us. He'll use other fears. The fear of losing a job. The fear of losing your reputation or popularity. The fear of rejection. The fear of criticism. Fear always focuses on the giant. You remember the story of David and Goliath when he was just a little lad. All the Jewish soldiers were afraid of Goliath because they were focused on the giant. But David, he had his eyes on the Lord. And when he saw Goliath, he remembered Goliath was a big man, but he remembered how big God was. And he kept his eye on the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. And that's why he was able to face and overcome that giant. So he said no to worldly fear. And then in verse 28, no to false religion. Notice in verse 28, by faith he kept the Passover and the sprinkling of blood, lest he who destroyed the firstborn should touch them. So there's the last judgment there, when the firstborn of Egypt were struck dead. You see, he rejected Egypt's religion, and he instituted the Passover, and he separated himself from Egyptian idolatry. That's what Moses did. And as a result of that, the firstborn of Israel were spared. So those are all the things that he said no to. Real quick, let's go through all the things he said yes to. Back at verse 25. Notice he said yes to the fellowship with the people of God. It says, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God, and rather than enjoy the passing pleasure of sin. So what's it tell us? It tells us in verse 25, Moses gave his life for God's people. God was calling him to a life of service. And that choice had consequences, but he said he would have to suffer affliction with the people of God, but it was worth it to him. So fellowship with the people of God continued. He said yes to the reproach for Christ's sake in verse 26. Notice it says, esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches. So he was saying yes to the reproach for the sake of Christ. And that Christ just means anointed one or Messiah. He was looking forward to the coming Messiah. But he chooses suffering rather than sin. That there's there being more evil in a small amount of sin than there ever could be in the greatest suffering. So God's people have always been a reproached people. The world doesn't like believers. The world that rejects Christ, they don't like you, and they're never going to. They're going to hate you. And that's the reproach of Christ that's on our life, because this world's not our home. And then he said yes to the eternal reward and not the earthly treasure, right? In verse 26, he saw God's reward. His loyalty to God and his love for his people were more valued to him than all the wealth of Egypt, all the wealth of Pharaoh. And he knew that the minute he died, none of that worldly wealth was going to matter. That would all pass away. Matthew Henry wrote this about this verse. He said, "Heaven is a great reward, surpassing not only all our deservings, but all our conceptions. It is a reward suitable to the price paid for it, the blood of Christ, suitable to the perfections of God, and fully answering to all his promises. It is a recompense of reward, because given by a righteous judge for the righteousness of Christ to righteous persons, according to the righteous rule of the covenant of grace. Believers may and ought to have respect to this recompense of reward. They should acquaint themselves with it, approve of it, live in the daily and delightful expectation of it. Thus it will prove a landmark to direct their course, a lodestone to draw their hearts, a sword to conquer their enemies, a spur to quicken them to duty, and a cordel to refresh them under all the difficulties of doing and suffering work." Boy, that's the late great preacher of the 18th century, Matthew Henry. And it's so powerful to read it to you. But verse 27, he said yes to the spiritual reality of God, right? He saw God through the eyes of faith, and it gave him strength to overcome the fear that would have been naturally present. And so his faith in God would be held up and strengthened, and then ultimately rewarded there in verse 27. And of course, it directed and impacted Moses' life there as he kept the Passover. Notice in verse 29, it says, "By faith they passed through the Red Sea as by dry land, whereas the Egyptians attempting to do so were drowned." And so God totally delivered them. What it proves us in the life of Moses, what's his testimony? These are the things he said yes to. These are the things he said no to. And boy, look at what God did in delivering him. God bless you.